Hey, welcome back. We are on 5.10 and 5.13. This is impacts of urbanization and runoff reduction methods. So a little bit of combo here. Our learning objectives for today are to describe urbanization and its causes, describe the negative impacts of urbanization, and discuss ways in which to remediate urbanization. So first, we should kind of talk about what is urbanization and different types of urbanization that really lead into urban sprawl, which is what we're going to focus on today. So there's really kind of three different places we see people living in today's world in really industrialized countries or economically developed countries. So, firstly, is going to be cities. So, these are going to be densely settled places with very defined boundaries. And the predominant type of job that you're going to see people having here is going to be something that's non agricultural. So, this is sort of like the types of jobs we see here in Orange County. Nobody is really largely invested in agriculture or agribusiness, but they're doing some type of job that's based within the city. So you can be a resident within the city and have that type of job, a non-agriculture based job. Now, a suburb is going to be another large metropolitan area, which is going to be similar to a city, but the density of the population is going to be significantly less. So if you live in a suburb, you generally live just outside of a large city. You may commute into work to actually access that city, but you're going to live in a you're not going to live in as close of a proximity to your neighbor as you would in a city. So you'll likely have some more space where you're living. And then the last thing is an exurb. An exurb is very similar to a suburb, but it's going to be unconnected to any like large central city or densely populated area. So with an exurb, it's going to kind of be on its own. And you can kind of picture like maybe a small town type thing. Everyone will be kind of close together within that area, but that area is not going to be near anything. So more of a rural type area. Now, since 1950, 90% of the population growth in metropolitan areas has occurred in suburbs. So we don't really see cities growing per se, but we see cities expanding into suburbs, and that's where most people want to live, is in a suburban area, or potentially people are starting to move to exurbs, which are even outside of suburbs. But the suburb is definitely the most common. And this movement outside of cities to suburbs, that's the idea of urban sprawl. This is just to show you sort of the difference between who's living in urban areas versus rural areas. A lot of this is because urban areas tend to have more economic opportunity or job opportunity for people, whereas in rural areas, there's very specific types of jobs, a lot of agriculture-based jobs, whereas in urban areas you tend to see a much wider array of economic or job opportunities, so that tends to drive people to those areas. So we see people living in big clusters of places, essentially. Now, because cities very quickly will become heavily populated, you start to see this idea of urban sprawl. So urban areas or cities get too full, so people start to go into what is rural areas, but those rural areas very quickly become suburbs as we start to sort of clear the boundaries that would normally make up a city. And so now suburbs are just the areas just outside of cities where a lot of people live, and they'll commute in to work within a city. And so that's pretty common now. I mean, if we're not counting COVID, with people maybe working from home more, but in a more traditional setting, employment opportunities would likely be in the city, whereas the suburban area would be mostly living. So why has urban sprawl really existed? Why has it been allowed to exist? Well, there's really four main causes. A large cause is that we have the convenience of automobiles and really large highways. So it's very easy to commute a slightly further distance. Like if you want to live in a suburb and work in a city, that's very easy for people. So we have this modern convenience of the automobile. Originally, people started to move to suburbs, though, largely because of cost of living. Cities can be very expensive and you don't get a lot of space. So people who want to have families, who don't have the income to be able to afford like the high-rise city type living, will move just outside of the city. They'll get a little bit more space, a little bit more bang for your buck, and you'll be able to support possibly a family, have a larger family. And so people sort of like the idea of that. These other two, urban blight and government policies, I'm going to talk about here on these next slides, but urban blight is something that drives people to suburban areas, and it's sort of this what we'd call a positive feedback loop. It's a problem that just keeps contributing to a greater problem. So as people begin to shift to suburbs, what happens is the taxes that are then being collected in that city will start to decline. As a result of less taxes being collected, there's less income for the actual city. And so things that should be maintained, like for instance, bus services or businesses, or even just the quality of the neighborhoods in terms of cleanup, all of that starts to decline or leave. And as a result, even more people want to live to the suburbs because they're like, I don't really like this city. It's not as clean as it used to be. I can't really take the bus anymore. They don't have my preferred routes, whatever it is. And so more people shift out of the city into the suburbs, and you continue to have this issue. This has sort of happened in the city of San Francisco a little bit. You see it's become like pretty unaffordable to live in that area for a lot of people. It's super expensive. And as a result, San Francisco has experienced quite a few budgetary cuts, and a lot of what has come at that expense is sort of the cleanliness of the city, a lot of trash issues and things like that. So it happens, but it also contributes more to urban sprawl as a result of more people wanting to live in those suburbs and sort of get out of these living conditions. And the next one is things like government policies. So federal and local laws potentially can also increase urban sprawl. So for instance, if we increase the price of gasoline, if we increase the gasoline tax revenue, then that allows us to build more highways. Or if we tax people more, we can build more highways, use those taxes to build more highways. If there's more highways, the suburbs can expand even further. Traffic's going to get worse. Commutes are going to get longer. More gas is going to be used. There's going to be more people out there, more taxes to be collected. We can build even more roads, and it becomes even easier and easier to grow into an urban sprawl type situation. And we have a lot of things that pay for additional highways. The Highway Trust Fund Act, for instance, pays for the maintenance and growth of new highways. You probably noticed here in Orange County, no matter where you're driving, there's always a piece of the highway that is either under construction, or perhaps the highway is getting widened. So there's always kind of something going on there, and a lot of that comes from the collection of tax dollars or taxes on gasoline. What I just showed you here is called induced demand. We're basically creating a greater demand for more highways by building more highways. So we're kind of creating more and more of a problem by building more highways because more people are moving. We're creating more suburbs by building more highways, and it's just creating this greater problem. Another issue is something called zoning. So a lot of places are in cities are only zoned for very specific things. For instance, a residential area is not zoned for businesses. A business park may not be zoned for residential. A shopping center may only be zoned for certain types of businesses. So with that, you have to have even greater expansion. You can't have houses intermixed with businesses. You can't have business intermixed with industrial zones. And so as a result, we need even more space. So urban sprawl contributes even more. Now, with urbanization comes some negative impacts, which we've kind of already talked about a few of them, but big one here is going to be some of these health impacts. So lung irritation, this can be problematic because of all the additional pollution in the air, more cars driving on the road, potentially producing more smog. So you could see more of a lung irritation or lung disease becoming more prevalent in people who live in these suburbs or cities or urbanized areas versus people who live in rural areas. Heart disease may become more problematic. People are exercising less because they're spending more time in their car. They can't walk to places because everything's so spaced out. Perhaps their diet is worse than living in a rural area as well. They're not growing as much of their own food. They're relying more on like processed foods or local businesses who are making food for them. Obesity, again, people are spending more time in their car. There's less exercise. There's less opportunity for exercise outside. So potentially obesity is a problem. Depression and anxiety, sometimes sitting in traffic, commuting long distances, working further from home can create issues with depression and anxiety. And then additionally, the close proximity that people are living in could cause an increased spread of disease versus people living in a more rural area. Now, of course, there's also the environmental impacts of urbanization. Couple things here. The water cycle is largely impacted. So the more land that we take over, the more impervious surfaces that we have. So that means less water is able to infiltrate and percolate down into soil. So what we have is a bunch of water sitting on asphalt and cement that can increase runoff. It can increase evaporation. So we see a disruption to the water cycle there. And then also diversions of natural waterways like dams. If there is a waterway that is in the way of us building our suburb or our city, we may want to divert that water to make it more convenient for us. So a diversion of water could disrupt the natural water cycle. There's, of course, the pollution of air/water. This comes from, more combustion of fossil fuels, whether that be big industrial areas that are manufacturing something or just more people driving cars. Something called heat islands. This comes as a result, again, of more impervious surfaces. So things like concrete, asphalt, those have really low albedos, meaning they don't reflect very much light. Rather, they absorb light and heat, so they can trap heat. So cities tend to have like a much higher overall temperature than rural areas because heat gets trapped in those impervious surfaces. And then, of course, just increased use of fossil fuels, so more greenhouse gas emissions as more cars are burning more fossil fuels, especially as we need more transportation options to get from our suburb to our city. And then, of course, just more converted land. Urban sprawl and urbanization means we're taking over more land. So every time we build more cities or build more roads, we're taking over natural land and converting it into these suburbs or these cities, and that's a loss of biodiversity. On all fronts, a loss of a producer population and productivity to that ecosystem. A disruption of that ecosystem can disrupt trophic pyramids, can disrupt natural food webs, etc. So what are some remediation strategies? So how do we make it so that people who are living in these cities and living in these suburban areas aren't contributing as much to some of these larger issues that we're seeing either with human health impacts or environmental impacts? So the first thing is to create mixed land uses. We just said that a lot of times some government policy says that mixed land use is prohibited. You've got zoning, you've got things that are zoned for residential, things that are zoned for commercial. If we can create areas that are mixed land uses, where businesses and houses kind of coexist in areas that are close to each other, not only are we maybe perhaps taking up less space, but then people don't have to travel as far. So if I live across town from the grocery store, I have to get in my car. If I have mixed land uses, perhaps a grocery store is within walking distance to my house and school is within walking distance to my house, or a doctor or whatever it is that I'm looking for. So potentially that could help with the urban sprawl situation. Create a range of housing opportunities and choices. Remember, one of the reasons why people want to leave cities is because cities are expensive and there's very few housing opportunities. They're all small, you don't have a space, so people want to get out of that, get to those suburbs. If within your city you can create a range of housing opportunities and choices, that means not only styles but pricing, you're much less likely to see people wanting to move and contribute again to urban sprawl. Walkable neighborhoods, not only does this improve mental health, but additionally a decrease in fossil fuel combustion and the need for fossil fuel-based transportation, so people can walk or bike and get to some of the locations that they want to with ease, rather than it being challenging to get on a bike and get somewhere far across town. More trees and permeable surfaces. This helps with the runoff issue. This helps with the increased evaporation issue. This helps with the pollution issue possibly that's associated with runoff, because you have more permeable surfaces that can absorb some of that pollution. Take advantage of compact building design. So instead of constantly building up, or building out rather, build up, and make everybody have more compact space, versus everyone needing to have these massive houses that again contribute to urban sprawl. Preserve open space, farmland, natural beauty, and critical environmental areas. A lot of times these are the first areas to go when we need more space. But of course, this improves mental health of people. It's aesthetically pleasing. It offers recreational opportunities, and then again allows us to preserve some of the natural environment in a city. A variety of transportation choices, so not only housing opportunities, but also transportation choices. This means perhaps things like buses or trains, or the ability to walk or ride a bike or take your car, so that you aren't completely dependent on using a vehicle. When you live in Orange County, you're probably aware of this, but it's pretty hard to not have a car. If you could imagine not having a car and living here in Orange County, it's super challenging. Everything is pretty spaced out, so having the option to not have to get in your car because you are within walking distance, or there's additional transportation options like trains or things like that could be helpful. And then strengthen and direct development towards existing communities. So instead of immediately jumping to urban sprawl when we think we need more space, making use of something called infill. This means that if you've got spaces that are vacant lots or just areas that are just sitting there, instead of growing further, make use of things that are already within the community. And then place a strict restriction on urban sprawl. Once you've hit your limit in terms of how much land you're taking up, be committed to that. Don't continue to grow your boundaries even further. So these are also referred to as SMART growth goals for cities. So this is sort of a set of guidelines that when new cities are being built, they try to make them less like your traditional city and more like sort of this hybrid between a suburb and a city that offers more sustainability options, as well as sort of some more choices for people versus these two drastic things like cities or suburbs, and all of this to try to, again, prevent urban sprawl. But we know people are going to be drawn to more of these urbanized areas, so it's how do we make them more sustainable? Okay, I think that's it. Let me know if you guys have questions, and I'll see you in class. Thanks.